Gather close, traveler, for what I share with you are the echoes of our world, the whispers of the planet, its heroes and its tragedies, its battles and its sorrows. Among these echoes stirs the shadow of a man who walks between humanity and monstrosity, his story carried like a hushed secret through the flow of time. These are not merely stories, but the lifeblood of the land itself, carried through the life stream and remembered by those who still listen. Stay with me, and together we shall journey through its history, one legend at a time. And you, traveler, inscribe your mark in the journal. Tell us from which land you hail and how many years had passed when you first heard the tale of the man who sleeps in the coffin's shadow. For your story, too, is part of the great memory. If you would keep these stories alive, return often and bring others to the fire, so that more may hear the legends yet to come. Now, let us walk back through the ages and remember what was long ago. In the annals of the planet's darkest hours, when the very life stream writhed in anguish beneath corporate greed and scientific hubris, there emerged from shadow a figure whose crimson cloak would become legend. Vincent Valentine, the man who chose penance over peace, torment over oblivion. His tale is one of love corrupted, duty betrayed, and a soul suspended between humanity and monstrosity for 30 long years. To understand Vincent Valentine is to peer into the very heart of what Final Fantasy VII asks of us all. What price are we willing to pay for the sins of our past? Long before the meteor hung like a crimson eye above the planet, before Sephiroth's madness would shake the very foundations of existence, there was a young man in a dark suit who served the Shinra Electric Power Company with unwavering loyalty. Vincent Valentine was a Turk, one of Shinra's elite operatives, tasked with the company's most sensitive and often morally ambiguous missions. The Turks were Shinra's hidden hand, moving through shadows to protect corporate interests, eliminate threats, and guard the company's most precious secrets. They were professionals, bound by duty and an unspoken code that placed mission above morality, results above righteousness. Vincent embodied this philosophy completely. Tall and lean, with long raven black hair that framed his angular features, he moved with the predatory grace of a man trained to kill without hesitation. His red eyes, a detail that would later prove prophetic, burned with intelligence and dedication. He was neither cruel nor kind in his work. He was simply efficient, a tool honed to perfection in service of Shinra's vision of progress. Yet beneath this professional veneer beat the heart of a man capable of deep feeling, a vulnerability that would ultimately prove both his salvation and his damnation. The year was approximately 30 years before Cloud Strife would first set foot in Midgar, and Shinra's ambitions were expanding beyond mere energy production. The discovery of the Cetra, the ancients who had communicated with the planet itself, had opened new avenues of research that promised to unlock power beyond imagination. Professor Gast, Shinra's leading scientist, had been excavating archaeological sites, seeking traces of these legendary beings and their connection to the life stream that flowed beneath the planet's surface like blood through cosmic veins. It was during this period of fevered research that Vincent was assigned to a mission that would alter the course of his existence forever. He was to serve as security and liaison for a classified project taking place in the remote mountain town of Nibelheim, where an old Shinra mansion had been converted into a research facility. The project, he was told, involved studying specimens recovered from archaeological digs, specimens that might hold the key to understanding the ancients and their relationship with the planet. Nibelheim itself seemed an unlikely place for world-changing discoveries. Nestled in the shadow of the towering mountains, it was a simple town where life moved at the pace of the seasons. The people were warm, honest folk who worked the land and knew little of Shinra's grand ambitions. Yet beneath their very feet, in the basement laboratories of the old mansion, Experiments were being conducted that would echo through the decades to come, rippling outward to touch every life on the planet. The mansion stood at Nibelheim's heart like a dark jewel, its Victorian architecture a stark contrast to the humble buildings surrounding it. Shinra had purchased the property years earlier, drawn by its isolation and the extensive basement that could be converted into laboratory space. To the townspeople, it was simply another corporate acquisition, a sign of Shinra's growing influence. They could not have known that within those walls, the very nature of life and death was being questioned, challenged, and ultimately perverted. Vincent arrived in Nibelheim on a crisp autumn morning when the leaves painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, colors that would forever remind him of what he was about to lose. His mission briefing had been deliberately vague, speaking only of biological research and the need for absolute security. As a Turk, he was accustomed to operating on a need-to-know basis, but something about this assignment felt different. There was an undercurrent of excitement among Shinra's executives, a sense that they stood on the threshold of a breakthrough that would reshape their understanding of the world itself. In the mansion's converted laboratories, Vincent met the research team that would become the architects of his tragedy. Professor Gast, brilliant and driven, spoke passionately of his discoveries among the ruins of the ancients. His eyes blazed with the fervor of a man who believed he was unlocking the secrets of creation itself. Working alongside him was a younger scientist whose reputation preceded him even then, Dr. Hojo, whose thin frame and wire-rimmed glasses belied the ruthless intellect that lurked behind his pale eyes. Hojo spoke little but observed everything, his mind constantly turning over possibilities, calculating variables, seeking ways to push the boundaries of what others deemed impossible or unconscionable. And then there was Lucrecia Crescent. Even now, decades later, her name carries with it the weight of tragedy, the echo of choices that would damn them all. Dr. Lucrecia Crescent was brilliant beyond measure, a scientist whose understanding of genetics and cellular biology rivaled even Hojo's. But where Hojo was cold calculation, Lucrecia was fire and passion, a woman who threw herself completely into whatever captured her interest. Her work on the connection between emotional states and cellular regeneration had earned her recognition throughout the scientific community, and Shinra had recruited her specifically for her expertise in biological adaptation. She was beautiful, certainly. Her long chestnut hair caught the laboratory lights like silk, and her eyes held depths that seemed to reflect the very mysteries she sought to unravel. But it was her mind that truly captivated Vincent from their first meeting. Here was someone who could speak of genetic sequences with the same passion a poet might reserve for verse, who could theorize about the nature of life itself while her hands moved with practiced precision through complex procedures. She was everything Vincent had never known he yearned for, brilliant, passionate, alive in ways that his shadowed existence had never permitted him to be. In those early days of the project, Vincent found himself drawn into conversations that stretched long into the night. Lucrecia would speak of her research, her theories about how consciousness might interact with biological systems, her dreams of unlocking humanity's potential for evolution and adaptation. Vincent, trained in observation and analysis, found himself fascinated not just by her ideas, but by the fervor with which she presented them. Here was someone who believed utterly in the possibility of a better world, someone whose optimism had not yet been tainted by the realities of corporate ambition and scientific hubris. As autumn deepened into winter, so too did Vincent's feelings for Lucrecia. He began to understand that his assignment in Nibelheim was becoming something far more significant than any mission briefing could have conveyed. This was not merely a job to be completed with professional detachment. It was the awakening of parts of himself that he had long kept buried beneath layers of duty and discipline. For the first time in his adult life, Vincent Valentine was falling in love. But love, as the ancient stories tell us, is rarely without its complications, and Vincent's growing feelings for Lucrecia were shadowed by circumstances beyond his control. The research project itself was evolving, taking on dimensions that troubled even his hardened Turk sensibilities. The specimens that Professor Gast had recovered were not merely archaeological artifacts, they were biological samples of extraordinary potency and unknown origin. The team had begun to refer to their primary subject as Genova, a name derived from ancient texts that spoke of a calamity from the skies. Genova, as Vincent gradually came to understand, was no ordinary discovery. The creature, for lack of a better term, possessed cellular structures unlike anything previously encountered. Its cells could adapt, integrate with other biological systems, and fundamentally alter the genetic makeup of living tissue. Professor Gast theorized that Genova might be connected to the Cetra, perhaps even their progenitor or a related species. The implications were staggering. If they could understand and harness Genova's adaptive capabilities, they might be able to create humans with enhanced strength, intelligence, and longevity. The project that had begun as archaeological research was transforming into something far more ambitious and dangerous. They were no longer simply studying the past, they were attempting to engineer the future. And at the center of this grand experiment was the woman Vincent had grown to love, her scientific brilliance now focused on unlocking the secrets of an entity that seemed to exist outside the normal parameters of planetary life. It was during this period that Vincent began to notice changes in the dynamic between his colleagues. Hojo, always calculating, had begun to pay increasingly close attention to Lucrecia's work, and, more troubling to Vincent, to Lucrecia herself. The young scientist's interest seemed to go beyond mere professional collaboration. There were lingering looks, conversations that ceased when Vincent entered a room, and a growing intimacy between the two researchers that made Vincent's chest tighten with something he had never experienced before: jealousy. The winter nights in Nibelheim grew longer and colder, and Vincent found himself walking the mansion's halls at all hours, unable to sleep, unable to focus on anything but the woman whose laughter echoed from the laboratories below. He told himself that his feelings were a distraction from his duties, that a Turk had no business becoming emotionally involved with his assignment. But the heart, as he was discovering, does not bend easily to discipline or duty. It was on one such restless night, as snow fell thick outside the mansion's windows, that Vincent finally found the courage to speak to Lucrecia about what was growing between them. He found her in the laboratory, working late as she often did, her face illuminated by the green glow of specimen tanks that lined the walls like technological sarcophagi. She looked up as he entered, and in her eyes he saw something that gave him hope, a warmth that went beyond professional courtesy, a connection that seemed to acknowledge the feelings he had been struggling to express. "Vincent," she said, and his name on her lips sounded like a benediction. "You look troubled. The project isn't keeping you awake, is it?" He moved closer, drawn by an invisible force that seemed to emanate from her very presence. "Not the project," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Something else. Someone else." For a moment, the only sound in the laboratory was the gentle humming of machinery and the soft bubbling of the specimen tanks. Lucrecia's eyes searched his face, and he saw understanding dawn there, along with something that might have been reciprocal longing. "Vincent," she began, but her words were cut short by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They stepped apart instinctively, professional distance reasserting itself just as Hojo entered the laboratory. The thin scientist's pale eyes moved between them, and Vincent caught a flash of something cold and calculating in that gaze, as if Hojo were processing new data and adjusting his conclusions accordingly. "Working late again, Doctor." "Crescent?" Hojo said, his voice carrying its usual flat precision. "And Mr. Valentine. I trust everything is secure for the evening." Vincent nodded curtly, suddenly aware that this moment, this near confession of feeling, had been observed and catalogued by perhaps the most dangerous mind in the facility. All secure, Doctor. I was just finishing my rounds. But as he left the laboratory, Vincent carried with him the memory of Lucrecia's expression, the moment of connection that had passed between them like an electric current. He also carried the growing certainty that Dr. Hojo had witnessed far more than casual conversation, and that this observation would somehow be factored into calculations and plans that Vincent could not yet fathom. The winter wore on, and the project continued to evolve in ways that increasingly troubled Vincent's conscience. The research had moved beyond theoretical study into practical application. They were no longer simply analyzing Genova's cellular structure. They were attempting to create hybrid organisms that combined human tissue with Genova cells. The early experiments were conducted on laboratory animals, and the results were both fascinating and horrifying. Creatures that had once been ordinary specimens were transformed into something altogether different, stronger, more resilient, but also fundamentally altered in ways that seemed to violate the natural order. Professor Gast expressed occasional concerns about the direction of their work, but his objections were consistently overruled by reports from Shinra's executive board. The company had invested too much in the project to allow ethical considerations to slow their progress. They wanted results, and they wanted them quickly. The pressure to deliver breakthrough discoveries intensified with each passing month, and that pressure began to affect the entire research team in ways both subtle and profound. Lucrecia threw herself into her work with even greater intensity, as if trying to lose herself in the complexity of genetic sequences and cellular behavior. Vincent watched her grow thinner, more distant, consumed by questions that seemed to have no easy answers. He tried to offer support, but found himself increasingly shut out from her inner world. Their conversations became shorter, more professional, tinged with a formality that felt like a denial of what had almost bloomed between them. It was Hojo who provided the explanation for Lucrecia's withdrawal, though his revelation came with a cost that Vincent had not anticipated. On a cold February evening, as sleet hammered against the mansion's windows, Hojo requested a private meeting. They sat in the mansion's library, surrounded by dusty volumes that seemed to mock the cutting-edge research taking place in the floors below. "Mr. Valentine," Hojo began, his voice carrying its usual clinical detachment, "I believe it's time we discussed the future direction of our research and your role in it." Vincent studied the scientist's pale features, searching for some hint of his intentions. "I'm here to provide security and support, Doctor. Whatever the project requires." "Indeed." Hojo adjusted his glasses, a gesture that somehow seemed more predatory than nervous. "And you've been exemplary in that role. However, recent developments have created complications that require careful handling." "What kind of complications?" "The personal kind." Hojo's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. "Dr. Crescent has informed me of her pregnancy." The words hit Vincent like a physical blow. For a moment, the library seemed to spin around him, reality tilting on its axis as he struggled to process what he had just heard. Pregnant. Lucrecia was pregnant. And from Hojo's tone, from the satisfaction that lurked behind his clinical facade, Vincent understood with terrible clarity who the father was. "I see," Vincent managed, his voice sounding distant even to his own ears. "Congratulations, Doctor." "Thank you." Hojo leaned forward slightly, his pale eyes fixed on Vincent's face with the intensity of a researcher observing a particularly interesting specimen. "Of course, this development opens up extraordinary opportunities for our research. A human subject developed from conception in an environment rich with Genova cells. The possibilities are unprecedented." The full horror of what Hojo was suggesting slowly dawned on Vincent. They were not simply conducting research on laboratory animals anymore. Hojo intended to use his own unborn child as an experimental subject to expose the developing fetus to Genova cells and observe the results. It was monstrous, unconscionable, a violation of everything that separated science from sadism. "You can't be serious," Vincent said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's your child. Lucrecia's child." "It's the future of human evolution," Hojo replied calmly. "An opportunity to create something far superior to baseline humanity. Dr. Crescent understands the significance of what we're attempting. She has agreed to participate fully in the experimental protocol." Vincent rose from his chair, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Everything in his Turk training told him to remain calm, to analyze the situation professionally, to find a solution that served Shinra's interests. But something deeper, something more fundamentally human, rebelled against the cold calculation in Hojo's voice. "This is madness," Vincent said. "I won't allow it." Hojo's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere of the room, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. "Allow it, Mr. Valentine. I'm afraid your opinion on the matter is irrelevant. This is a scientific endeavor of the highest importance, sanctioned by Shinra's highest authorities. Your role is to ensure security, not to make policy decisions." "My role is to protect this facility and everyone in it," Vincent replied, his voice carrying the steel of absolute conviction. "That includes protecting innocent life from unnecessary harm." "How noble." Hojo stood as well, his thin frame somehow managing to convey menace despite his unimposing stature. "But your definition of unnecessary harm differs significantly from mine, and more importantly, from Shinra's." The confrontation might have escalated further, but it was interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway. Both men turned as Lucrecia entered the library, her pregnancy now visible in the gentle curve of her figure. She looked between them, and Vincent saw in her eyes a mixture of determination and desperation that broke his heart more thoroughly than any physical blow could have. "Vincent," she said, and her voice carried a note of finality that he recognized with growing dread. "I need you to understand. This is my choice." "Lucrecia, you can't possibly believe." "I believe in the future," she interrupted, moving closer to Hojo with a gesture that felt like a sword thrust to Vincent's chest. "I believe that what we're doing here could change everything, could make humanity stronger, better, more capable of surviving whatever challenges lie ahead." Vincent stared at her, seeing in her face the woman he had fallen in love with, but also something else, a fervor that bordered on fanaticism, a willingness to sacrifice anything, even her own child, in service of her scientific ideals. "And if you're wrong, if this destroys rather than enhances, if your child suffers for your beliefs, then we'll learn from the results," Hojo interjected smoothly. "Knowledge always comes with a price, Mr. Valentine. The question is whether we're willing to pay it." That night, Vincent walked the halls of the mansion until dawn, his mind churning with possibilities and probabilities, with duty and desire, with love and horror. He had been trained to follow orders, to serve Shinra's interests without question or hesitation, but he had also been raised with a conscience, and that conscience screamed against what was about to unfold in the laboratories below. By morning, he had reached a decision that would define the rest of his existence. He would not stand by and watch as an innocent child was subjected to experiments that could very well prove fatal. He would not allow love to be perverted into scientific curiosity or hope to be twisted into hubris. Vincent Valentine, loyal Turk and dutiful servant of the Shinra Electric Power Company, was going to commit an act of rebellion. His plan was simple in concept, if dangerous in execution. He would wait until Hojo was absent from the facility, then confront Lucrecia one final time, appeal to whatever remained of the woman he had loved beneath the zealous scientist she had become. If he could not convince her to leave willingly, he would find a way to extract her from the situation, to take her somewhere safe, where she could raise her child without the shadow of Genova's influence. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Professor Gast had requested Hojo's presence at a conference in Midgar, leaving the mansion temporarily under Vincent's security. It was the perfect moment to act, and Vincent approached Lucrecia in the laboratory where their story had begun with such promise and was now approaching its tragic conclusion. She was working at her usual station, surrounded by data screens and specimen containers, her hands moving with practiced precision through procedures that Vincent could not begin to understand. She looked up as he approached, and for a moment he saw a flicker of the woman he had known before ambition and scientific fervor had claimed her completely. "Vincent," she said softly, "you shouldn't be here. If Hojo finds out—" "Hojo is in Midgar," Vincent replied, moving closer to her workstation. "Lucrecia, we need to talk, really talk, without protocols or projects or corporate interests, just the two of us, like it used to be." She set down the instrument she had been holding, and he saw her hands trembling slightly. "What happened between us? It was a mistake, Vincent. A moment of weakness that I allowed to cloud my judgment. But I've chosen my path now, and I have to see it through." "Your path?" Vincent's voice carried a note of desperation that he had never heard from himself before. "Lucrecia, you're talking about using your own child as an experimental subject. How can you call that a path? How can you call it anything but madness?" Tears appeared in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "Because I believe in what we're doing here. Because I think we're on the verge of something that could benefit all humanity. And because the alternative, living with regret, wondering what might have been, is worse than any risk." "And what about love?" Vincent asked, the word hanging between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. "What about what we felt for each other? Does that count for nothing in your calculations?" For a long moment, Lucrecia was silent, and Vincent dared to hope that he had reached some part of her that remained untouched by scientific ambition. But when she spoke again, her words shattered that hope like glass against stone. "Love is a chemical reaction, Vincent. Hormones and neural pathways designed by evolution to encourage reproduction and pair bonding. What we're doing here transcends such biological imperatives. We're creating something new, something better than what nature intended." "You're creating an abomination," Vincent said, his voice flat with conviction, "and I won't let it happen." The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. Vincent had hoped to convince Lucrecia through reason and emotion to appeal to whatever remained of the woman he had known. When words failed, he considered physical intervention, removing her from the facility by force if necessary, but he had underestimated both her commitment to the project and the resources at her disposal. As Vincent reached for her, intending to lead her away from the laboratory and out of the mansion, Lucrecia activated a security protocol that he had not known existed. Alarms began to sound throughout the facility, and automated systems sealed the laboratory doors, trapping them both inside the room where their relationship had first bloomed and was now dying its final death. "I'm sorry, Vincent," she said, genuine grief in her voice, even as her finger remained poised over the control panel. "But I won't let you stop what we're trying to accomplish here. The future depends on it." Vincent stared at her across the narrow space that might as well have been an ocean for all the distance it represented. The woman he loved had chosen science over sentiment, progress over personal connection, and he found himself trapped not just by locked doors, but by the terrible realization that he had lost her long before this moment. The doors opened 20 minutes later, and Hojo entered with several Shinra security personnel. The scientist's pale eyes took in the scene with calculating precision. Noting Vincent's position near the control panel and Lucrecia's defensive posture, he spoke quietly to the guards who took positions around the laboratory, their weapons drawn but not yet aimed. "Mr. Valentine," Hojo said in his characteristic flat tone, "Dr. Crescent has informed me that you attempted to interfere with our research protocols. As head of this project, I'm afraid I must ask you to step away from the equipment and submit to questioning regarding your actions." Vincent looked at the guards, calculating his chances of fighting his way out of the laboratory and the mansion beyond. He was a Turk, trained in combat and accustomed to impossible odds. But he was also outnumbered, and any violent action would likely result in harm to Lucrecia and her unborn child, the very outcome he had been trying to prevent. "I was trying to protect innocent life," Vincent said, his hands raised in a gesture of temporary surrender. "Something that should matter more than your experiments." "Innocent life?" Hojo seemed genuinely puzzled by the concept. "Mr. Valentine, we are attempting to enhance human potential, to create something superior to our current limitations. How can such an endeavor be anything but beneficial to innocent life everywhere?" "By treating people as test subjects instead of human beings," Vincent replied. "By putting ambition ahead of ethics, progress ahead of compassion." Hojo nodded as if Vincent had confirmed some hypothesis he had been considering. "I see. You've allowed personal feelings to cloud your professional judgment, a common failing, but one that cannot be permitted to interfere with work of this importance." The scientist gestured to the guards, who moved forward to flank Vincent on either side. "You'll be confined to quarters pending a full investigation of your actions and recommendations regarding your future with this project. I trust you understand that any further attempts at interference will be met with considerably more serious consequences." As the guards escorted Vincent from the laboratory, he caught one last glimpse of Lucrecia. She stood beside her workstation like a sentinel guarding secrets too dangerous for ordinary comprehension, her face a mask of scientific determination that concealed whatever remained of the woman he had known. Their eyes met across the distance, and for just a moment he thought he saw regret there, a flicker of the connection that had once promised so much. Then the doors closed between them, and Vincent found himself in the hallway that had witnessed so many of their conversations, so many moments of growing intimacy that had ultimately led to this betrayal of everything he had thought he understood about love and loyalty and the price of progress. The next few days passed in a blur of interrogation and evaluation. Shinra officials arrived from Midgar to assess Vincent's reliability and determine whether his actions constituted a security breach serious enough to warrant permanent removal from the project. Vincent answered their questions honestly, making no attempt to hide his objections to the experimental protocols or his feelings for Dr. Crescent. He had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat, and he found himself strangely at peace with the consequences. It was during this period of limbo that Vincent learned the full scope of what was planned for Lucrecia's child. The experiments would begin before birth, with Genova cells introduced into the developing fetus through a series of controlled injections. The child would be monitored constantly, its development tracked and analyzed to determine how successfully the alien cells integrated with human biology. If the initial results were promising, additional enhancements would be attempted, pushing the boundaries of what a human being could become. The project had a name, the Genova Project, and the child, when it was born, would be designated as Specimen S, later to be known by the name Sephiroth, though Vincent would not learn that detail until decades later, when the silver-haired warrior's madness would threaten all life on the planet. As autumn returned to Nibelheim, painting the mountains in the same crimson and gold that had welcomed Vincent to his doom, he received word of his final assignment status. He would remain with the project, but in a greatly reduced capacity. His access to sensitive areas would be limited. his security clearance downgraded, and his interactions with research personnel carefully monitored. He was being kept close enough to prevent him from sharing classified information, but far enough from the actual experiments to ensure he could no longer interfere. It was a kind of exile within exile, and Vincent accepted it with the same professional detachment that had once defined his service to Shinra. He told himself that as long as he remained at the mansion, he might still find some way to help Lucrecia, to protect the child that would be born into circumstances no innocent life should have to endure. The winter passed with agonizing slowness. Vincent maintained his reduced duties while the project continued in the laboratories below. He caught occasional glimpses of Lucrecia, her pregnancy progressing normally despite the experimental treatments she was receiving. She seemed to glow with inner fire, her scientific fervor undimmed by the physical challenges of carrying a child. When their eyes met in the halls, she would nod politely, professionally, as if they were strangers who had been introduced once at a corporate function. It was in the early spring, when the mountain snows were beginning to melt and new life was stirring throughout the valley, that Vincent made his final, fatal decision. He could no longer stand by passively while horrors were perpetrated in the name of progress. He could no longer tell himself that his reduced role was sufficient penance for his inability to prevent what was happening to Lucrecia and her child. If he was going to act, it had to be now, before the birth, before the experiments moved into their next phase. His plan was desperate, born of months of frustration and growing certainty that he had failed in every way that mattered. He would confront Hojo directly, not with words or appeals to conscience, but with the tools of his trade. Vincent Valentine, Turk operative and expert marksman, would end the Genova project the only way he knew how, with violence, swift and final. He chose his moment carefully, waiting until the facility was operating with minimal staff during the late evening hours. Hojo was in his private laboratory working on calculations that would determine the timing and dosage of the next round of experimental treatments. Vincent approached through corridors he knew by heart, his footsteps silent on floors he had walked countless times during his months of exile. The laboratory door was locked, but Vincent's security access, though reduced, still granted him entry to most areas of the facility. He entered quietly, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm, prepared to do what duty and conscience demanded. And so, traveler, the telling must pause here. The tale of the man who walks between humanity and monstrosity is not yet finished, and the shadows of his past still linger, waiting to be uncovered. The planet whispers still, but for now, we must leave Vincent's path in silence. Before you depart, add your thoughts to the journal. Share what this first half of the journey has stirred within you, what questions remain, or what sorrows echo in your heart. In this way, your reflections become part of the story itself. Return when the fire is lit again, and together we shall continue where the tale was left. Until then, keep watch in the dark, for the rest of Vincent's story awaits.